Okay, let's move on to, I think this is chapter 14, spinal cord. And so this would be 203 spinal 1. Maybe you could get through this chapter 1 recording. We'll see. Okay. So spinal cord functions: conduction, locomotion, and reflexes. And so conducting action potentials up and down the spinal cord, ascending pathways and descending pathways. We'll talk about those. The ascending ones are usually sensory. The descending ones are usually motor. And locomotion, being able to move, and reflexes, which are stereotypical protective, usually protective, automatic actions. Okay, segments of this spinal cord: cervical in the neck, thoracic, the chest, lumbar in the abdomen, and sacral in the pelvic region. And there are 7 cervical vertebrae, there are 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and I think 5 sacral. And there they all are right there. The cervical part, thoracic part, lumbar part, sacral part. And the sacral vertebrae are fused. What was I about to say? Oh, and most people think that your spinal cord goes all the way down practically to your rear end, but it doesn't. It really stops about midway down. It's as if you, as a child, your whole back was the spinal cord, but as you grow older, it doesn't grow any longer, and what is below the very bottom of your spinal cord is what's called the cauda equina, which is a big bundle of very thick nerves that are mostly going to your legs and feet and lower structures. And it's called cauda equina, which is Latin for horse's tail. Okay. And then we have these plexuses, which are spinal nerves that are leaving. Now, there's a spinal nerve that leaves between every 2 vertebrae, the spinal nerve that leaves on both sides. And they anastomose. They come together into these masses of nerves that cross each other, and they're called plexuses. There's a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus, a lumbar plexus, and a sacral plexus. All right. All right. And most of these things that we see on this slide are going to be lab things. In the lab, we're going to look at models of the spinal cord and learn about all different parts of the spinal cord. So this is the anatomy. So let's go on to the meninges. Now, we covered the meninges in the brain, and they're the same in the spinal cord. What is different is the white matter, gray matter arrangement. Mostly in the brain, remember, gray matter on the outside, the cerebral cortex. There is some gray matter on the inside. Remember, the basal nuclei are gray matter that's deep within. So there is some gray matter inside, but it's mostly gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside. As soon as you get in the spinal cord, it's exactly reversed. The gray matter gets on the inside, and it is surrounded by white matter. Okay, spinal tracts. Ascending, so remember, a tract is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. Ascending is coming up from below, and these are sensory. And for almost all sensory pathways, so we're going to learn some sensory pathways here. There are 3 neurons in the pathway: the first, second, and third order neurons, right, for most sensory pathways. And then here is the arrangement of how sensory information comes into the spinal cord and how motor information leaves the spinal cord. And so we have to talk about a little bit of anatomy here. They're called roots, like a posterior root here. Remember, this is posterior or dorsal. Remember, dorsal and posterior, the same thing. This is anterior or ventral down here. So it's a posterior root. This is sensory information, comes in through the posterior root. And the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are in what's called the posterior or dorsal root ganglion right here. And this is either somatic sensory, which is sense that you're aware of, or visceral sense, which you sense that you're not aware of. It enters the spinal cord and it goes up into these horns. This is a dorsal horn, this is a ventral horn. Or this is a lateral horn here, and this is ventral horn. And the sensory neurons will innervate or connect with interneurons that are in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And they will go on and perhaps stimulate motor neurons whose cell bodies are in the lateral and the anterior horns. Sometimes, now visual sense you're not aware of, but somatic sense you are. And of course, there is a interneuron that's going to receive the sensory information and send its axon into the white matter here. These are called columns. The white matters are called columns. Dorsal columns, ventral columns, lateral columns. These are tracks, fiber tracks, ascending and descending. This would be an ascending. And motor information right here, both autonomic motor and somatic motor, goes out through the anterior or ventral root. And those all come together into what's called a spinal nerve, which is almost always mixed. It's both carrying sensory and motor information. Okay. So here is a ascending pathway, a sensory pathway. So we have receptors for discriminative touch, proprioception, precise pressure, and vibration from neck, trunk, limbs. This is the primary neuron here. It enters through a posterior root, and this is a spinal cord, and its axon goes superiorly to the medulla oblongata, and it innervates the secondary neuron in the medulla oblongata, and that axon of the secondary neuron decussates in the medulla oblongata. Remember, almost all of these pathways are going to decussate, and they usually decussate in the medulla oblongata, or they decussate in the spinal cord. This one, for these particular sensations, decussates in the medulla oblongata. Then this axon goes through the medial lemniscus, which we talked about before, major sensory pathways, and it goes up to the thalamus. And the cell body for the third order neuron, or tertiary neuron, is in the thalamus. And then that axon projects to the primary somatosensory cortex, and you feel that sensation, right? For a somatic sensation. Okay, then there's receptors for pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure. These are dendrites out in your skin. And they come into the spinal cord also through a dorsal or posterior root. And they innervate interneurons in the gray matter. And that's with a cell body of the, now in this case, the cell body of the secondary neuron is in the spinal cord, not in the medulla oblongata. So the axon, the secondary neuron, decussates in the spinal cord, goes superiorly, and goes all the way to the cell body of the tertiary neuron, or third order, which is in the thalamus. So that's the same way. That's exactly the same for both of these pathways. The cell body of the tertiary neuron is in the thalamus, and it projects to the primary somatosensory cortex. Its axon projects to the primary somatosensory cortex. And the only the big difference is where the cell body is for the secondary neuron. It's in the spinal cord here, not in the medulla oblongata. Okay, now here is the exception to the rule. This is proprioceptive information. And this comes in to the spinal cord as the usual way for sensory information. And the cell bodies for the secondary neurons are in the spinal cord, and one of the secondary neurons stays ipsilateral. Ipsilateral means stays on the same side, doesn't decussate. The other one from the other side does decussate, and they go up to the pons, to the cerebellum, and provide proprioceptive information to the cerebellum. So this is only 2 sensory neurons rather than 3. The other pathways, you have 3. Oh, and these tracks, you can always tell whether these tracks are sensory or motor, or whether they're ascending or descending, by the names. This is the spinal cerebellar tract, and they always put the first part is where it originates. So in this case, it originates in the spinal cord, so that's what the spinal comes from, and it goes to the cerebellum, so spinal cerebellar tract. Other motor pathways, we'll talk about cortical spinal tracts, where it starts in the motor cortex, in the cerebellum, and goes into the spinal cord. So that would be a descending pathway. And there we are, descending pathways, motor. There's only 2 neurons in these pathways, an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. And the upper motor neurons, their cell bodies are always in the cerebral cortex, in the motor cortex. And the cell body for the lower motor neuron is always in the spinal cord. And they go through what I just said, cortical spinal tracts. So naming, first part is where it comes from, cortical, meaning the motor cortex. Second part where it's going, spinal. So from the motor cortex to the spinal cord. And then there's also spinal cortical tracts, which would be sensory tracts from the spinal cord up to the motor cortex. Okay, nerve coverings. Remember, these the axons are covered by myelin. Most of these are myelinated axons, and then there's a endoneurium that covers over the myelin, and then a fascicle of several axons is covered by a connective tissue covering called a perineurium, and then the entire nerve is covered by the epineurium, which is dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, so here is a descending pathway, a motor pathway. Here's the upper motor neuron here, cell bodies in the primary motor cortex, going into the internal capsule, down to the midbrain, down to the medulla oblongata. And it, see how it decussates? Well, one of them decussates in the medulla oblongata, and then it meets the motor neuron, whose cell body is in the spinal cord down here. And one, in this case, one of them decussates in the medulla oblongata, and the other one decussates in the spinal cord. And here's the lower motor neuron that's going out to the skeletal muscles. Okay, now we're going to talk about arrangement of rami. Rami um, are different uh, nerves that come off of spinal nerves in the peripheral nervous system, usually just outside the central nervous system, just outside the spinal cord. The spinal nerve is going to break up into these different branches called rami, a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus, and also what are called the rami communicans, which is going to be visceral motor. Right now, we've been only talking about somatic motor, which is the motor you're in control of. But later on, when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we'll talk about visceral motor, the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. That is visceral motor. We talked about the plexuses. Dermatomes are what section of skin on your body is innervated by which spinal nerve. Those are called dermatomes. Now I'm going to show you a slide later on talking about the dermatomes. And then somatic reflexes, stereotypical reactions of muscles or glands to stimulation. So these are stereotypical, is they're always the same, they're automatic, you don't really have any control over them if you don't know they're coming. And these are usually protective. So we go over and touch the table here, and I don't realize it's really, really hot. And I don't know it's hot, and I touch it, I get pain sensation, and I automatically withdraw my hand, and I'm not doing that consciously. That's an automatic thing. And then I realize, there's an axon collateral that's leaving from my spinal cord down here, coming up to my somatic sensory cortex saying, oh, pain, I just got burned. Right? So you learn that after you withdraw your hand. But if I can take the pain, I can override those reflexes. If you know it's coming, you know the pain is coming and you can take it, I can hold my hand there. And this is important for getting inoculation, for example. You know this needle is going to be stuck into you. A little bit of pain is coming. Normally, if somebody stuck you with a pin, you would automatically react. Well, now you know the pain is coming. So you can actually send inhibitory information down to those motor neurons and inhibit them from moving. So some reflexes you can inhibit. So here's the arrangement of the rami. So here's the anterior and posterior root coming together to form the spinal nerve. And this spinal nerve spinal nerves are actually really short. They're only a few millimeters from about here to here is the spinal nerve. And then they break up into rami. A posterior ramus, so sometimes called dorsal ramus. Remember, posterior and dorsal, they're the same thing. And an anterior or ventral ramus here. Now, why is it that this posterior ramus is really thin and the anterior ramus is really thick? Well, think of it this way. What kind of information is coming along the posterior ramus? Either sensory information from your back muscles or controlling your back muscles. That's it. That's the only thing that's dorsal or posterior to the spinal cord is our back muscles. But how much stuff is ventral or anterior to the spinal cord? Lots of stuff. That's why the anterior ramus is always much larger than it's got a lot more axons in it. They're going a lot more different places than just to and from back muscles. But then also, we have these two what are called rami communicans. And they are leaving really the ventral ramus, and they're going to a sympathetic, going to and from the sympathetic trunk ganglia that are along the whole length of your thoracic and lumbar segments of your spinal cord. You have sympathetic chain ganglia. And this is how the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is set up. It's a thoracic lumbar system where the motor neurons leaving the spinal cord do so in the thoracic or the lumbar region. And when we talk about parasympathetic, we'll talk about a cerebral sacral, a cranial sacral arrangement, where parasympathetic motor neurons leave either from the cranium or from the sacral region of the spinal cord. There are the dermatomes right there. So that's what, sensory information from this part of your chest goes along T6, from this part T7, so on and so forth. Or either motor function going out there or somatic sensory touch, pressure, pain comes in through those spinal nerves. So your whole body is represented, remember, in the somatosensory cortex. All right. So like I said, reflexes. What are the hallmarks of a reflex? Require stimulation. Or somehow you stimulate the fire. They're quick, usually really quick, because they're usually protective. They're involuntary. Like I said, if you don't know what's coming, you're going to do it, you don't have any control over it. And they're stereotypical, which means they're always the same. Right? There are 5 parts: receptors, and then an afferent nerve, which is a sensory nerve. Afferent information brings, afferent information is from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. Then you have an integrating center, which is usually for these reflexes just a spinal cord. Then you have an efferent nerve, which is a motor neuron. This is, efferent is from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. And then you have an effector, which can affect some kind of change. And it's usually a muscle or a gland. So here is what's called a reflex arc. So you get stuck with something and you don't know this pain is coming, get stuck with something, activates receptors. That pain information comes along a sensory nerve signal is propagated through sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Here, it interacts with an interneuron. The interneuron then innervates a motor neuron, whose information goes out along the anterior root, out in spinal nerve, out into ventral ramus, to a skeletal muscle, and you withdraw your arm. And that's the reflex. What's not shown here is that there's probably an axon collateral, perhaps in the motor neuron, from the interneuron, I mean, or from the sensory neuron, there's an axon collateral, which means a branch axon that goes out into a column here and sends information to your cerebral cortex, telling you that you've just injured yourself, all right? And this is after you've already withdrawn your hand. Then you find, oh, wow, that was painful. I just injured myself. Okay, muscle spindle. This comes down to proprioception. These are proprioceptors. They detect the amount of muscle stretched. And that will tell you where your body parts are in space because of how stretched those muscles are. The regular muscle cells are called extrafusal fibers. The fibers inside muscle spindle fibers are specialized and they're called intrafusal fibers. And they're surrounded with a sensory the dendrites of a sensory nerve, which will send information to your cerebellum, telling you how stretched, giving information to your cerebellum of how stretched those muscles are. Okay, gamma motor neurons. These are motor neurons that can adjust the length of the intrafusal fibers, so it can adjust sensitivity. And we don't have to get into that very much. The important thing to know is that these are proprioceptors, and they inform your cerebellum of the amount of stretch of your muscles. Okay, afferent creates a steady stream of impulses. This decreases when a muscle contracts because they're shorter. And so if you put your muscle this way, the muscle spindle fibers are getting shorter, so they're going to decrease the amount of firing. They fire when they get stretched. Now, in your triceps spindle, you're getting stretched, so those muscle spindle fibers are firing, and these ones are not. And then when you go the other direction, it's the opposite. These muscle spindles start to get stretched, and they fire and tell your brain that you just extended your arm. Okay, can inform the brain of degree of muscle contraction and how fast it constricts. That's a typo, constracts, how fast it constricts. Gamma motor neurons stimulate contraction of ends and muscle intermuscular fibers to maintain sensitivity when muscle is partially to fully contracted. So the length of these interfusible fibers are adjusted. Once you stretch them, then these gamma motor neurons contract them, so it keeps it sensitive. Okay, specific somatic reflexes. So we'll look at some of these. The stretch reflex, to maintain posture and to prevent overstretching of muscles. And the antagonistic muscle is inhibited. I'll give you examples of this in a moment, in the next few slides. The flexor reflex, similar to stretch but longer lasting and polysynaptic, and ipsilateral. Polysynaptic means more than one synapse. Ipsilateral means it stays in the same side. Contralateral would mean it goes to the opposite side, or it decussates. Crossed extensor reflex, a contralateral reflex to maintain balance. So this one's going to decussate. And a tendon reflex is the stretching of Golgi tendon organs. Inhibits alpha motor neurons to prevent excess stretch. So we have the muscle spindle fibers, but we also have these Golgi tendon organs that are in tendons and tell your cerebellum how much a tendon is stretched. Okay, here. This is as if, okay, you're holding something that weighs a certain amount. Then all of a sudden, something else is put on top of that. So it's heavier now. That's going to stretch the muscle. So here, muscle spindle detects stretch. So now it's become heavier and your muscle is stretched. You want to counteract that to keep on holding it up. So the muscle spindle detects stretch. Muscle stretch stimulates sensory nerve signals to travel to the CNS, into the spinal cord, which has two axon collaterals here. One of the axon collaterals goes to the motor neurons in the muscle that's stretched. So if you're holding up something and it gets heavier, all of a sudden your biceps is stretched. So now the motor neurons to that, the bicep is going to be stimulated to contract stronger to hold up the thing that's heavier now. And there's going to be an interneuron that's going to be stimulated that has an inhibitory synapse on the muscles to the antagonist, to the motor neurons that are going to the antagonistic muscle. So when you hold this thing up, your biceps will contract to maintain you holding it, and your triceps will be inhibited from contracting. Right? So that's the stretch reflex. Okay. Here, you want to hold up your leg here. When you muscle contraction increases tension to tendons detected by Golgi tendon organs. So go like this, and the quadriceps tendon is stretched now, right? So muscle contraction stimulates sensory nerve impulses to travel to the CNS. It goes down here. And again, it's similar to the stretch reflex, but it uses more interneurons, and the sensory neuron stimulates this inhibitory motor neuron that goes to the muscle that was stretched to inhibit it, and then the other interneuron goes down to the motor neuron. It stimulates the antagonistic muscle, to contract it in the hamstrings. So your quadriceps are inhibited and your hamstrings are contracted to bend your leg like that. All right. So muscle relaxes and there's relief of tension on a tendon for your quadriceps. Muscle contracts, reciprocal activation. Okay, this is a crossed extensor reflex. This is if you're walking along and you step on something sharp and you reflexively pull your leg up. And this is really the withdrawal reflex. And it's very similar to one we just saw, that your quadriceps is inhibited and your hamstring are stimulated so you can draw your foot up, but you have to maintain balance. So you have to contract muscles on the other leg. And that's where this information here, one interneuron decussates and goes to the contralateral side and will stimulate extensors in the other leg so that you can maintain balance. So you would contract flexors in this leg to withdraw your leg from the pain, and then you want to maintain balance on the other leg, and that's contracting extensors to keep your leg extended. So this is a contralateral reflex. And that's it. So this was a short one. And that's it for the spinal cord. So we'll close this up. And so the spinal cord will just have 203 spinal 1. Okay. Stop sharing. Let's stop recording. I'll see you later.